Hi, it is time to read. We are on chapter 10, Hand Over That Thief. Remember, we are reading Curse of the Ancients, the fourth book of the Infinity Ring series. And we are in the Mayan times, and we are trying to help Sarah, Rick, and Dak solve the break. Fix the break. Hand Over That Thief, chapter 10. Quiet, men, Ithic said, his chest heaving in and out. It won't be long now. But Rick noted that the king of Ismail was breathing just as loudly as the rest of them. They had run several miles through the hot and humid jungle, taking the long road out of town, as Ithic called it. Sweat streamed down Rick's face, stinging his eyes, salting his lips, but he tried to follow orders and breathe more quietly. The plan was to take a different route than the men from Calamul, circling around to cut them off from the front. Once they saw the men emerge on the path, Rick would spring into action. His particular role in Ithic's plan was by far the most dangerous, but he wasn't complaining. This was his purpose now, to help the people of Kaisa's village, and if helping them meant putting his life at risk, that's exactly what he'd do. Easy, men, Ithic said, regaining his breath. As they waited, Rick thought about how different his new life would be. A few days ago, he was 1,000% committed to the historian's mission. It was the very blood that pumped through his veins. It was the very blood that pumped through his veins, would. But today, he was going to step away from the front lines of the historian's struggle. His loyalty now belonged to the people of Ismail and Kaisa. His heart was hammered inside of his chest as it imagined waking up in the jungle village for the rest of his days. Ithic turned to Rick. You ready, son? I'm ready, sir, Rick said, remembering just to toss the codex over your shoulder when you get it. Hurakan will be there to pick it up. Yes, sir, Rick said. Rick glanced back at Hurakan. The man nodded at him. Then Rick glanced at the man who had possession of the trial codex. It was inside a leather bag slung across his shoulder. Rick whipped his head back around when he heard hushed voices coming from the path. Men from Calamul were approaching. He raised up in the squat, readying himself to scamper through the dense foliage and into the footpath, but Ithic held Rick by the elbow and shook his head. Not yet, he mouthed, pointing toward the path. Rick saw that there were 6 men walking in a tight formation, but none of them had been in the temple with Pascal, and there was no sign of the codex. They were telling the truth, Ithic whispered back to his men. They have reinforcements. After the man had passed, Ithic continued, I've seen this tactic before. They have a group of men lead the way to scout the path. Then we will see a middle group, which will likely include the man who took... which the middle group would likely include the man who took the codex, and finally there will be a scout bringing up the rear. He will have to act quickly, men. Our plan will have to be fully executed before the final group is upon us. Rick expected to see the second group right away, but there was more waiting. And the longer he waited, the more questions came into his head. What if he couldn't wrestle the codex away from whoever was holding it? What if he failed in this very first role as a member of Kaisa's community? What if the men who'd stolen the codex went a completely different way? He wiped the sweat from his forehead and swallowed. If there really was going to be a second group, what was taking them so long? Seconds later, he heard the crackling of branches in the jungle behind him and spun around. The rest of the men turned around too, some brandishing their knives. To Rick's complete surprise, it was Sarah who emerged with Dak. One of the warriors put a finger to his lips, urging them to stay quiet. but Dak snuck over to Rick anyway and knelt beside him. "You have to come with us," he whispered. "You're walking around again?" Rick said. "I'm more than just walking around." Dak stood up and did a stupid 5-second dance and then knelt back down. "Seriously, though, you have to come with us." "Can't do that," Rick said. Sarah leaned over their shoulders, whispering in Spanish so that their translators would have to recalibrate, allowing them a moment of privacy within the crowd. "We figured out the riddle, Rick. We're supposed to take the codex with us, and I was able to work out the second date from the riddle. It's in 1562. That must be our next stop." Rick balked. "Why would you take the codex with you?" Ithic shot them both a look. Rick didn't. Rick knew. He couldn't understand what they were saying, but he wanted them to be silent. To protect it," Dak said. "Sarah told me some guys had already tried to steal it. We both believe this is the break we're supposed to fix before we move on, and we seriously need to move on." Rick looked over his shoulder at Sarah, who was nodding. He turned back to Dak, who whispered, "Come on, dude. Be a team player." "If you don't quit bothering me," Rick whispered back, "we'll never get the codex back. We're waiting for the people who have to pass. Now go on, shoo." "Oh, I see," Dak said, rubbing his hands together. "Finally, a bit of the Mayan warmongering I've been hoping for." Rick shook his head. The kid was much easier to get along with when he was unconscious. "Look," Dak whispered, "one of us has to grab it so we can work the heck out of this place. Sarah has the ring all programmed and ready to go. Here's the idea. Let's live to fix another break. This place has been hard on my system." Rick stared at Dak, trying to decide the best way to break the news that he wasn't going anywhere, because it was definitely best to get that part out of the way. "I wanted to talk to you about that, Dak," he began. "I've been doing a lot of thinking over the past couple days." "Well, that's a step in the right direction," Dak said. "Ha ha. Anyway, I'm just going to come on out and say it. I'm not going to continue from here." Rick wasn't able to finish the sentence because right then, Ithic grabbed his elbow again and pointed down the path. Rick turned and saw 5 men walking up the hill, including the 2 he'd seen in the temple earlier. One of them had a folded up codex under his left arm. Rick furiously waved Dak away. This was his moment. Ithic held on to Rick's elbow until the last possible second, and then he pushed Rick out from behind the trees. Rick's adrenaline kicked in as he scampered down the densely packed hill, shouting at the Kalamon men, "Take me with you, please, they'll kill me." The men stopped, clearly caught off guard. The front 3 pulled their knives. Ithic and the few of his warriors followed Rick down the hill, commanding, "Stop that boy! He has to be punished for his crimes." Rick pushed past the first row of Kalamon men and jumped onto the man holding the codex. "Please," he continued shouting, "they'll kill me." "Get off me," the man with knives shouted. One slashed Rick's cheek. Blood instantly trickled down his face and neck. But Rick kept his wits about him. He had to execute the plan. He yanked the codex out of the man's hand, still pleading for help, and tossed it over his shoulder. Rick glanced back in time to see Jurikon pick it up and pretend to hand it to Ithic, who already had a trial codex in his possession. They're trying to do the old switcheroo. Then thrust the trial codex up under his head and shouted, "Men, this belongs to you. Take back your codex and display it in the great empress in the land. All I ask is that you return your hand over to this thief." The Kalamon men were busy kicking at Rick and slugging him in the back and head. Rick covered himself and closed his eyes, and he could now hear Dak and Sarah screaming for the men to stop. But the beating did not stop until Ithic stepped over to Rick and waved everyone away. He handed over the trial codex and pulled Rick to his feet. only to slug him square in the jaw. Rick was face down on the path again with no memory of falling. "Take him!" Ithic shouted back at the warriors. So this is all pretend, right? Several of Ithic's men picked Rick up and held him by the arms behind his back as Ithic announced, "This boy was caught looting huts in the wake of a great storm. He will be punished in the square." Rick was slightly dazed from all the abuse he'd taken, and he was still clear-headed enough to smile on the inside. The plan was working perfectly. Calamun men had backed off. Huracan had already left for the village to hide the real codex. The men holding the fake looked through a few pages of glyphs, but didn't seem to have any clue that there was a difference. Ithic commanded to his men, "Lead him back, now!" But before they could take Rick anywhere, one of the Calamun's men said, "Why not sacrifice him here in the jungle? Isn't that what a thief deserves?" "Yeah, do him in now," another one shouted, "so we can watch." "No," a voice from the crowd yelled. Rick looked up to see Kaisa hurrying through the foliage and into the path. "He didn't steal anything," she shouted, shoving one of the men who held Rick. The men shouted, managing to keep a hold of Rick. "It's okay," Rick said to Kaisa under his breath. Kaisa, ignoring Rick, and shouted at Ithic, "He didn't steal anything. It's all a bunch of lies." Many of the Calamun men were laughing now, which meant Rick realized they were no longer calling for his head. Ithic played along with Kaisa's assertion by commanding, "We will attend to this matter back in the village. A verdict on the thief will be made by this evening so the gods can bear witness." Then he turned to the visitors from Calamun and said, "Men, I thank you for capturing the prisoner. Please give my regards to Yukaman the Great." They all nodded. One said, "A couple of our men are missing if you come across any of those misfits." "You can try them before the gods, too," another man interjected. All the Calamun men laughed. The first man continued, "Tell them we're already on our way to the next village." "Of course," Ithic said. Rick couldn't believe his eyes. The men from Calamun all were turning and continuing down the jungle path away from the Ismail. The plan had worked. Ithic's men were all quietly congratulating each other as Rick reached up to touch his bloody cheek. "Kaisa," Ithic said, grinning from ear to ear, "how you always innately sense what's happening. I'll never understand." "You knew it was all part of the plan?" Rick asked. Kaisa nodded. "I knew Ithic would never strike an unarmed person. It had to be an act." Rick saw that she was holding a metal locket with a chain. "Yes, I'm very sorry about the punch," Ithic said. "You sacrificed so much for us." Rick felt a gush of pride as he watched Ithic join his men, but he had a worried look on Kaisa's face. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Will you not stay here?" "What do you mean?" Rick said. "I thought it was all settled." "I've changed my mind. I want you to go." Rick's whole body felt suddenly paralyzed. "I don't understand," he said. "Earlier you said, 'It only matters what I'm saying now,'" she said with a stern look on her face. "Please go, Rick." Dak and Sarah pushed through the men to get to him. "Wow," Dak said. "You took some serious abuse." "Are you okay?" Sarah asked. "We tried to rush down here to help, but the men hiding in the bushes stopped us and told us all about the plan. You agreed to this?" Rick nodded, but he could hardly follow Sarah's words. He was just too numb from what Kaisa had just said to him. He watched her back away, wondering what had changed. Why was she so against him staying now? "We're leaving right this second," Dak said. "We've heard there might be another group coming through here, and I don't want to take any chances." Sarah was already kneeling down on the path, reaching into her satchel for the ring. She pulled it out and powered it on. Rick looked at Kaisa. He decided he had to stay anyway. She would come around in time. "Dak, Sarah," he began. "It's very hard for me to say, but do you all have anything you need?" "Everything you need?" Kaisa interrupted, pushing herself forward again. "I think we do," Dak said. He turned to Rick. "Sarah and I now believe the Codex is supposed to remain here in the village under Kaisa and Pascal's protection. Right, Sarah? You think our mission is just to get it back from these men, right?" "I'm positive," Sarah said. "Which we've done, thanks to you, Rick." Honestly, Dak said, great work, dude. Rick was going to try one more time to explain. He intended to stay, but then he saw the callous look on Kaisa's face, like he suddenly disgusted her. And then one of Ithac's men said, look! His finger was pointing down the path where a third group of Calamon men were fast approaching. There was at least 15 men marching in formation, less than 50 yards away. Come on, Dak shouted to Sarah. We need to get this now. I'm trying, Sarah shouted back. Ithic and his men were already retreating up into the jungle. Rick grabbed Kaisa's arm before she could go and said, you really want me to leave? She stared back at him completely straight-faced and simply said, yes. Then she handed Rick the locket. Rick looked at the snake carved into the front of it, and he looked up at Kaisa. His heart was breaking. But I thought, you thought wrong, she said, cutting him off. He let her go, the only thing he could do now, and watch her disappear into the bushes. Stay where you are, one of the Calamon men shouted at Rick, Dak, and Sarah. Rick turned and saw the men hurrying toward them. Now, Sarah, Dak shouted. Got it, she grabbed back. Grab on. Rick reluctantly reached for the part of the ring, staring up at the tree Kaisa had just ducked behind. His face stung, and his back and ribs and heads were pulsing with pain. But that was nothing compared to the pain he felt inside. Something had changed for Kaisa. She no longer wanted him around. The men were less than 10 yards away when Sarah shouted, Here we go! The ring brightened, and Rick was so jarred by the abrupt feeling of its power that he accidentally dropped the locket onto the ground. Wait, he shouted, reaching down for it. But just before he could warp his fingers around the snake's metal tail, he was whisked away into the blackness, and it was lost. And that was chapter 10. Chapter 11 is what Sarah saw. Enjoy the weather. It's beautiful outside. Get some fresh air. Continue to look at books and read and listen. And I'll see you soon. Bye.